Shalom, everyone. This week's parasha is Parashat Devarim. Devarim is the name of the book of Deuteronomy, and this is the first chapter, the first parasha, the first Torah portion in the book of Deuteronomy, which is the final of the 5 books of the Torah, the Law of Moses. So Parashat Devarim consists of the book of Deuteronomy chapter 1 through chapter 3, verse 22. And we find some very, very foundational principles in this parasha, so foundational that pretty much every aspect of Israelite Jewish observance of God's commandments are tied into this week's parasha. How so? We find in chapter 1, verse 5, that's the first aliyah of this week's parasha, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 5, it says that Moses began to clarify this Torah. And then the chapter goes on, and of course it doesn't go into all the details of the various commandments that Moses had given up to that time in the Torah. Torah, usually translated as the law, really means guidance or instruction, and it's the general term used to refer to the entire body of God's commandments contained in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 5 says that he began to expound upon or clarify the Torah. All right, and then what follows, as I said, is not an explanation of every single law of the Torah, but rather what follows is a explanation of the founding of what we call the Great Sanhedrin in English, in Hebrew called the Beit Din HaGadol, which is essentially the ancient Congress / Parliament of ancient Israel, which was not just randomly established, but it was established under the leadership of Moses by the command of God. And that's what follows when it says in the Torah, Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 5, that Moses clarified this Torah. How did he clarify it? Well, it's really not a very lengthy explanation after that. It's just that it refers to the establishment of this court, drawing from all the leaders of Israel of the various different tribes, and it also refers to the establishment of lower courts as well. So, of course, if lower courts didn't know the answer to a particular thing, they would bring it to a higher court, all the way up to reaching the leadership of ancient Israel, convened as a court on the temple premises. Now, chapter 1, verse 16, so chapter 1, verse 18 gives us good insight into the common Karaite or anti-oral law argument, where you have in a few places in the Torah where it says that Moses wrote down all the words of this Torah. Moses wrote down all the words of God's guidance, right? And so then the argument is, if you wrote it all down, then how could there be anything more? All right. Besides the fact that that's a contradiction to their own concept of Sevela Yerusha, that the Karaites, Jews who traditionally reject the oral law, the oral explanations of the Torah, they have their own body of oral law. But aside from that, we can see from those verses that say Moses wrote down all the words of this Torah, we can get an idea as to what that means and what it doesn't mean when we look in Deuteronomy chapter 1, in the context of the establishment of the court. It says in verse 18, "And I commanded you at that time all the things you should do." And clearly, what is just commanded in the verse right before, verse 17, is the authority of this court. So it's not that Moses commanding everything isn't that he elaborated every single detail of how you execute it properly. It's not that he explained in detail or wrote in detail how you properly observe every commandment that's contained in the Torah, but rather all of these matters, all of these words that was commanded in the Torah, that's a reference to the basic concepts of all the commandments of God. But how they are to be carried out, that's left up to the explanation of the Great Sanhedrin, the Beit Din HaGadol, the ancient parliament the ancient Congress of Israel that was established under Moses and granted authority under Moses by God. And as we said, you can find that in chapter 1, verse 17, immediately before verse 18, where it says that he commanded at that time all the things which you should do. So in the verse before that, verse 17, the judgments of that court are called the judgments of God. Quite significant. So it's not that the judgments of that court are literally equal to the 613 commandments that God commanded in the Torah, but rather it's part and parcel together with it, because it's the explanation of how we carry out those commandments, how we actually do those commandments in any given scenario. If the Torah, if the law, the guidance that God had given us directly through Moses in a written form had included all possible scenarios for all times and for all people, it would have been practically infinitely thick and impractical. It's already big enough. I mean, how many people have seriously read through the law of Moses or the entire Bible? Sadly, not many. It's already big enough. So to create a demand that it would include an infinite amount of scenarios, honestly, is quite absurd. But rather, as we see in Deuteronomy chapter 1, the solution is that the Torah, the commandments of God, are elaborated upon through this court. And this we find in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 5, what is called Moses' clarification of the Torah. That clarification is not what just any old random person feels like the verses are speaking to them. It's not just what seems most logical to anyone on an individual level. Granted, biblical verses can be understood by two equally sincere and equally educated people. Verses can often be understood in multiple ways by those same equally sincere and intelligent people. And it may be that theoretically one's view makes more sense, or even both views make sense, but the authoritative clarification is only through that ancient court and no other body. So the remainder of what we find in this week's parasha has a lot to do with the battles, the warfare of Israel as they begin to fulfill the commandment, a commandment which we also find in this week's portion, that the people of Israel inherit the land of Israel, the promised land. What is the promised land? The land of Israel. Who's it promised to? The promised land. Promised to who? To the people of Israel, to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who are bound by the covenant. And that includes all those who join them, as explicitly stated many times in the Torah. So, on that note, wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Leave any questions or comments below. Like, share, and subscribe. Yalla bye. Shabbat Shalom.